If you tuned in last Friday, you may have heard a conversation I had with Dr. Darren Russell, a prominent Far North Queensland health professional who discovered he had 9 children scattered across Australia after doing an ancestry test. You see, he'd been a sperm donor during his university years, but had never really thought anything more of it. Nothing like an ancestry test to throw a massive spanner in the works. Today we're going to learn a little bit more about this story because we're joined now by one of Dr. Darren Russell's biological sons, Guy Hampshire. He's a 38-year-old intensive care paramedic who, until very recently, had no idea he was born through sperm donation. Now, you can only imagine what sort of existential crisis that could trigger in someone. Fortunately, Guy has been willing to join us this afternoon to share his story with us. Guy Hampshire, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Oh, g'day, Adam. Thanks for having me.
How did you find out that your father wasn't your biological father?
So on the 6th of May, I received a letter in the mail from VADA that was a registered post and had to pick it up from the post office. And it just basically broadly said, we have some information about your birth. You should either call this number or speak to your parents. So I called the number.
What did you find out?
Found out that I was a sort of early 1980s IVF baby from an anonymous donor, which was news to me.
I could just imagine what that moment would have been like. But how did you react to that kind of news?
It's initially pretty numbing. I think, other siblings of mine would probably say different things. For me, I tried to take a lot of the emotion out of it so I could comprehend it. And then I just went home and had a chat with my wife after figuring it all out.
So they give you the options. You can speak to your parents or you can speak to us. You chose to speak to them. Did at any point you then have to have a conversation with your parents?
So the man I thought was my dad, I nursed him through cancer in 2020 and he passed away in October. And then mum, I figured she'd had 38 years to give me the information and it hadn't been forthcoming, so I may as well just go to the other source.
Wow. Well, Guy, incredible that you get this information one day and your world gets tilted off its axis. Can you tell us about the first time you actually worked out who your biological father then was?
So the way the system works in Victoria, they can't actually give you any further information. You can elect to have, liaise with your biological father, however you see fit. So obviously, because mine was a Friday, I sent in the paperwork, but wasn't going to get any response to that till the Monday. So my wife and I did a fair bit of Facebook sleuthing, trying to find a 6'3" doctor that was a medical specialist in North Queensland, but we didn't find anyone who was the right fit. Then Monday, so Sunday was Mother's Day, so spent that with Mum, which was a little bit awkward because I hadn't talked to her about it at that point. I thought I didn't want to trash a Mother's Day, and waited to Monday to speak to the man who's my biological father.
Wow. What was that first conversation like?
So the first conversation with Darren, but also with all my other siblings, it's kind of like a job interview. And it's all about just information acquisition so that you can just try and piece together what your identity actually is and see what parts of your identity actually align with the people that you're genetically entwined with versus the people that raised you.
We're hearing here from Guy Hampshire, 38-year-old intensive care paramedic who, until recently, had no idea he was born through sperm donation. The man that donated that sperm is a prominent North Queensland doctor, Dr. Darren Russell. What was it like the first time you actually met your biological father?
It was pretty funny. So if we look at, I'd been sent photos of him and I'd liaised and chatted with some of my other siblings, so they'd sent photos to each other as well. We all have a very unique stance for when we get our photos taken, which I've started terming Russell stance. And we kind of, the first time I saw him, I was coming to meet, he was down for a conference in Melbourne. and I was going to meet him at a restaurant to have dinner. And as I'm walking up towards the restaurant entrance, it's on a second story, and there's a big window. And I see someone standing in the window who's standing exactly the way that I stand. And so I figured out that was him, which was reassuring.
Is it an emotional moment, Guy, given you've got no emotional attachment to this person other than the information that they are your biological father?
Yeah, so it's really bizarre. It's the first time in my life that I've actually sat across the table from someone that looks like me. Because my mother's side of the family is Irish, and they're all about 5'2". I'm 6'6", so not quite 5'2", and different colorings to what the man I thought my dad was, and to his extended family. So uh, it's it's really bizarre, but it's quite comforting to sit across to someone who looks like you. It put me at ease because we share some very similar mannerisms. Um, and even just the way we walk is very similar. When one of my siblings met Darren for the first time, the first thing they said was, "You walk like Guy," because we'd already met. So yeah, in that regard, there's levels of comfort to it when you meet each other face to face. It kind of puts you at ease.
You shared the sad story that the person you always thought was your dad actually passed away recently. You cared him through his cancer journey. It sounds like you had, a very strong connection to this man. Does it change how you feel about
Uh,
who you thought was your dad?
it does a bit. It would have been nice to have had that opportunity to have that discussion. We didn't have a particularly close relationship until I was probably in my late teenage years, through sort of him not really being there too much. So it kind of that makes more sense to me now as to why that sort of stuff happened, and to how then his maturity probably allowed him only until I was a late teenager to actually start having a proper relationship.
And Guy, you mentioned that for a while you couldn't address this with your mother. Did that conversation ever take place?
Yeah, it did. There's no guidebook for how to have this conversation successfully. So I don't think anyone that finds himself in this would state that the conversation was a raging success. Um, though there was no like yelling or shouting or anything, but just trying to understand is the hard part. You know, um, growing up, there was sort of some questions. I had adopted cousins, and some of the things that they described emotionally, I kind of resonated with when thinking about that side of the family. So I would question if I was adopted quite a lot when I was younger, which I was always told I wasn't, which is true to an extent. Um, so in that regard, there's some difficulties, and I feel that there's some times where it probably could have been told, and it would have helped me out along the way, maybe forming my identity better and things like that. But yeah, the discussion went down about a day after talking to Darren. I just wanted to know I needed more information before I could have that chat.
This is a powerful conversation you're hearing this afternoon. Guy Hampshire with us live on ABC Radio, 38-year-old Victorian man, intensive care paramedic who until recently didn't know who his dad was. He was born through sperm donation to Dr. Darren Russell, who was a university student when he was doing his sperm donating and had never really thought anything more about it. Didn't even know he had 9 children scattered across Australia until he'd done an ancestry test. Guy, is there a cautionary tale in these ancestry tests? Because they do, it's not often, but they can throw absolute spanners up. We heard from one of our listeners maybe a month or so ago whose family found out her father had had an affair, and she had step siblings that she didn't know had existed through one of these tests as well. So, I mean, presumably when you do these tests, there's no big warning sign or neon light saying you may actually have your world tipped on its axis here. Do you feel like going through this and seeing what's happened that there should be a little bit more warning or education?
Uh, you could put it that way. You could also flip it on to the parents to have the maturity to have these discussions with their children when they're growing up. If you're mature enough to utilize sperm donation, or if you're mature enough to have an affair and have a family with someone else, then you're probably mature enough to have that discussion with your children so that they're aware that they've got family out there. Um, so yeah, I would probably put it more on the parental generation to have some a little bit more skin in the game in that regards than the DNA testing.
And part of the reason that we're having this discussion today, but beyond the obvious, very human side of this story, is that there's a Queensland parliamentary inquiry that's just found that the rights of offspring outweigh sperm donors' right to anonymity, and that children born through this process should have access to their biological father's information when they turn 18. How do you feel about that recommendation?
Look, I definitely support that as a recommendation. If I link it to something to do with my career, when we talk about heart attacks, one of the biggest prognostic indicators for early heart attacks and early heart disease is a familial linkage. So if you know that you have that familial linkage, you can then monitor it better and give yourself a better outcome or less likely to have a heart attack at a young age. Conversely, if you don't have those, then you might even engage in some activities that give you further risk factors and predispose you more to health outcomes that are negative.
Well, what a roller coaster you've been on, Guy Hampshire, over the last few months. It sounds like you've had this reunion with Darren. Now you're connected to all these half siblings that you never knew you had. Is there going to be a big family reunion at some point?
We did. We had a little. We termed it Russell Palooza about a month or two ago at a pub where we got to all catch up. I've met most of my siblings now, or at least talked to most of them. It's quite interesting that I haven't met them before. There's a few sort of moments where we could have crossed paths. One sibling and I worked at the same venue at the same time. I played football with two of my siblings' cousins. I worked as an anaesthetic nurse with another sibling's wife. So there's been a few
Sliding
moments of,
doors moments, right?
yeah, very much so. So I think, yeah, it's been a very positive experience getting to know a really wonderful group of people.
Thank you so much for being willing to share your story with us this afternoon, Guy. And I guess the message to anyone out there that had children through sperm donation that hasn't shared that news with their kids from you is that really that's something that they probably should be doing.
Yeah, look, so I think when people my age were conceived through the process, they were informed to never tell that pick a donor that you kind of think will look like your husband and hope for the best. Whereas over time, the evidence has been suggestive that it's actually the younger you tell people, the better outcomes they have, particularly in regards to mental health and self-identity. So I think even if I'd been told at 20, I would be better off than finding out at 38, and definitely being told by your caregiver who loves you is probably a better way to find out from a faceless entity on the phone and a letter in the registered mail.
Guy Hampshire, thank you so much for sharing your story and best of luck with the next Russell Palooza.
Cheers, thank you.
It's Guy Hampshire with us, and what a story. I mean, what every emotion imaginable when you find out that news. It sounds like there has been some joy though from this discovery, obviously for the 9 children, or from Guy's perspective anyway, and from Darren, Dr. Darren Russell, who didn't know he had these 9 children born as a result of his sperm donation. If you tuned in last Friday, you may have heard a conversation I had with Dr. Darren Russell, a prominent Far North Queensland health professional who discovered he had 9 children.